It's good to be back.
It is. It's been too long, Simon.
It has. It's been far too long. The impact narrative rides again.
It does, and you haven't.
Albeit in different form, I should say.
Yes, and well, just as we're speaking, there's no room for controversy about whether it's the afternoon or the morning or the evening.
Certainly late morning.
It's morning. So, good morning.
Good morning. We are the Impact Narrative. I'm Simon Mabon.
And I'm Dr.Mark Garnett. And
from
yes,
the PPR department here at Lancaster University. And it's good to be back doing this again, Mark. I think what we'll do is just quickly introduce what we're going to do with the podcast and the video cast, as we're now excited to be doing, and then crack on with some news. So some of you may be aware that we had a radio show on local radio, but for creative differences and scheduling differences and a number of other issues, that had to end. So so what we're doing now is going to record it from the comfort of my own office, because well, the
leafy surroundings.
Indeed, the green leafy.
And the green theme here with the Lancaster, the emblem of Lancaster now, the wind turbine.
Indeed. Well, obviously we couldn't do it in your office, Mark.
Well, there's renovation work going on there at the moment.
And has been going on for about 5 years.
Something like that. It's gradually disappearing.
Some may say that it's a fire hazard, but
well, they do.
It's difficult to get in.
It is a fire hazard.
It is. It is.
There's no doubt.
In future episodes we can explore the
incendiary potential of my office.
But anyway, moving away from health and safety questions, I think what we try and do with the impact narrative is to talk about a range of different issues that are affecting us here in Lancaster, in the UK and across the world. Try and have a bit more time to talk about these news stories. But
only a bit more time.
Only a little bit more time. We've got about half an hour.
Yeah.
To cover a wide range of issues. So the things that have been taking place in the past week or so, we'll try and get to the heart of what's really going on. And I think there's a lot happened in the past week that we need to cover today, both in UK politics, but also globally, particularly in my part of the world, in the Middle East. But I think, Mark, we should start closer to home.
Really?
I think we should have a bit of an overview of what's been going on in the UK, because it seems to be...
Well, yes, I mean...
obviously you're going to start with I'm a Celebrity, Get Me Out of Here.
Well, I could, but no, I've fallen out of love with that programme after the first series.
Father.
Oh, is that right? Oh, I didn't notice that. Oh, he'd be very good entertainment value. More fun than his elder son, certainly. Yeah, so... Apart from that, obviously the jungle and all that kind of thing going on, and lots of interesting. And in fact, the motif here is kind of very
far from jungle, but
yeah, but so it gives you the impression. So obviously Brexit still looming over everything this week, whereas last week it was various revelations about the private lives of MPs. It's more like politics as usual now after what was a bizarre week last week. I suppose you kick off with the Brexit theme with the aforementioned Johnson, in this case Boris Johnson, and his sidekick Michael Gove sending some kind of ultimatum to the Prime Minister. And it's another example really of the usual disciplines of British government collapsing, and the rules not so much being rewritten as just completely torn up. And on this subject, it's interesting because we usually have a book of the week slot, and yours is usually a novel about the Third Reich, and I'm sure this week's no exception.
It certainly isn't.
Whereas I'm reading the diaries of the long-forgotten Lib Dem politician and former minister David Laws, and it's a very, very good diary indeed, and he worked very closely with Boris Johnson's partner in adventure. I was going to say crime there, but that would sound a bit loaded. And, this is a programme without any bias whatsoever. However, then it becomes rather difficult to talk about this any further, because the Michael Gove who appears in the pages of David Laws's book, which is not a secret, it's published a couple of weeks ago, is somebody who really doesn't belong in public life. Somebody just completely erratic, and you do wonder how on earth this person has ended up in a senior position in politics.
Sounds like quite a damning indictment of...
It is, but the thing that's very interesting is that David Laws doesn't want to say anything nasty about him, because clearly this is a person with a certain amount of charisma.
Sure.
It's just that you wouldn't let him anywhere near any decision beyond, you know, whether to have sugar in your coffee or not.
Right. Well, I saw him when I was down in Whitehall. I saw him, and
yeah.
he's deceptively tall. Which
Really?
surprised me. He is, very tall. But anyway.
Anyway, so that's the
moving
first
away
thing.
from his height. I just want to ask you, Mark. What has actually happened between Gove and Johnson? Because the last time they were mentioned, they were sort of bracketed together. It was that that Gove had stabbed Johnson in the back and shafted him with regard to the leadership debate.
Yeah,
and yet they seem to be working in cahoots again.
Well, I think there's two, probably, and again, this is obviously an outsider's perspective, but it seems to be there's two things at work here. And the first one is that they are both bound together as people who openly defied Cameron because they were both seen in one way or another to be related more intimately with Cameron, either school friendships or whatever.
Sure.
They were seen as people who Cameron had a kind of an emotional attachment to, either negative or positive. In other words, their adherence to the Brexit camp was unusually sensitive and controversial,
Right.
and they also seemed to be in favour of a clean break or a dirty break or whatever. They seem to think that Britain needs to get out of the European Union for constitutional reasons mainly, and that means taking whatever economic hit is coming down the line. And so they have actually got a shared interest in a hard Brexit.
Right.
So that's the first thing. The second thing, I'm afraid, and again referring to David Laws's book, is that, well, on the one hand we know that Boris Johnson has got insatiable ambition to become Prime Minister. Things have been going extremely badly for him in a lot of other respects, and this is a Trump-like tactic to divert attention from the situation he's got himself into in Iran, which is career-ending, potentially. So it would be career-ending if it wasn't for the...
Let's just delve into that just in a little bit more detail. So what is happening there, Mark?
Well, he, in front of a select committee, he made a gaffe which has its well, I think it's generally agreed, has put a very strong risk of a British national having a much longer prison sentence in Iran. And as I say, a foreign secretary is supposed to be extremely guarded with their language. And on this occasion, perhaps this was not so much Boris Johnson trying to use words to create an impression, it's just a slip of the tongue or whatever it was, but whatever it was, it isn't the kind of thing you want a foreign secretary to be prone to doing, and it's one of many things. So clearly he wouldn't be still foreign secretary if we lived in normal times. So you've got somebody with considerable ambition who's throwing the dice in all directions, because the dice, you know, is really, he's had his last throw of the dice many times, and recent opinion polls show that his support amongst Conservative grassroots is now slumping. And
but that was where his hardcore support was.
Well, that's it. There was always a thought that if he could get through to the final round of voting in the next leadership election, that he would win.
Right.
But now Jacob Rees-Mogg is quite comfortably ahead of him. But the other person in this, Michael Gove, isn't anymore any leadership contender, but according to the Laws book, David Laws speculates, and he saw Michael Gove at very close quarters, that Michael Gove is somebody who dislikes being out of the limelight. And so when you put these two things together, the Brexit, the shared view that a hard Brexit is probably a good thing for Britain, which, you know, in the end, or for their careers or whatever. In other words, a kind of an impatience with the Prime Minister's uncertain tactics.
Sure.
That's the kind of the principal thing that you might say is behind it, but there's also an awful lot of personality things behind it, and neither of these people seem to have any idea that cabinet government depends upon playing by certain rules. Priti Patel also showed that she didn't understand that cabinet government depends on certain rules. So what we've got is a collapse of cabinet authority, and you know, very interesting time, unprecedented times for British politics. But we need to talk about other things.
So we do, but
well,
before we get on to that, because I think there's an interesting segue, given that Boris's latest issue.
Johnson. This programme does not call him Boris.
Johnson. Boris Johnson.
Yeah, that's it. That's okay. Boris Johnson's okay.
His latest incident, let's say, is concerning Iran, and Priti Patel She resigned because of
Israel, yeah.
of Israel. So we've got a nice little segue into the Middle East, I think. But before we go there, I wonder, how long do you think Mr. Johnson has left as Foreign Secretary?
Well, I think we've discussed this before, and nothing can be predicted in British politics at all. The idea that Sir Michael Fallon would have resigned within, a few months of the last general election, that he would be a ministerial casualty early on in this Parliament, just would seem absolutely ludicrous. But it's happened. And the thing about Boris Johnson is that the Prime Minister, in a sense, has a vested interest keeping him exactly where he is, because any move would be a demotion, and he'd probably even refuse to accept any other job. And so the alternative is Foreign Secretary or backbenches, where even somebody like him, with his now tarnished reputation, could be very troublesome. Certainly the Prime Minister had reason to be frightened of him on the back benches. The problem now is that if we say the Prime Minister's tactic is to keep him there and let him make a fool of himself, without using too emotive language, that would continue to damage him and cut him out as a rival to her position. The problem is that if he does begin to damage British interests in some way, well, then it's unsustainable. So I would say, the trouble with Boris Johnson is that there are many occasions where he's put his foot in his mouth and he hasn't learned from those occasions. Yeah. This is the first occasion where it's a genuine kind of a failure to be diplomatic when he was trying to be diplomatic. All the other times he just isn't even trying remotely to be diplomatic. So, as I say, we're talking there about somebody who's completely unsuitable to be Foreign Secretary. Any other situation he would definitely be gone already, but there's a chance that he'll last as long as Theresa May. Whoever takes over will definitely get rid of him, because he will be a busted flush by then.
There are two things that I just want to pick you up on, and I think these are fascinating issues. The first is that with all that's been going on, the British politics seems to have been dominated by everyone but the Prime Minister or President, which is very strange. But also there seems to be, from what you're saying, if this analysis is right, that the Prime Minister is more concerned about Boris Johnson being on the back benches than occupying one of the great offices of state. And that certainly is a damning indictment of the state of the Foreign and Commonwealth Office.
Well, certainly the Foreign and Commonwealth Office, but also other things are happening which show, in a related aspect of this, the Prime Minister at the Mansion House tried to, I suppose, establish a strong international profile by attacking Russia and talking about Russia. Now, the terrible thing about this, it might seem a diversion from the problems over Brexit, but it isn't, because the Guardian's front page is all about Russia's attempt to influence the Brexit vote. And I'm sure that, when you're talking about a wafer-thin vote, as we have so many times, it's possible that the Russian influence was as important in the Brexit vote as it was with Mr. Trump, allegedly. So, what we've got is it's terrible. When a Prime Minister loses their authority, everything they do, by definition, looks cack-handed and amateurish. And, obviously the really big thing was the replacement of Sir Michael Fallon with Gavin Williamson, who nobody had heard of, and was palpably chosen because he was somebody Theresa May thought she could rely on, given one of the big jobs in government with no track record at all on the subject. So, as I say, we're getting a glimpse of what happens when a regime collapses, and it's collapsing in a way which is far more horrendous than the John Major years. In the John Major years, the things that happened, the unravelling of it all, kind of took place within a framework of understandings about what British politics should be. In other words, he made loads of terrible mistakes, and this beef war against the EU, all that kind of thing, was very demeaning. However, it was demeaning in a way which was kind of still somehow explicable within the traditions of British government. What we've got now is completely uncharted waters. And the final thing I say, obviously the Brexit thing going on, the bill going through the House of Commons, and against the background of the negotiations, clearly going very badly for Britain. And I was thinking about what I might say if we had time to discuss this. It's very, very difficult to be anything other than, to seem biased one way or another. And I was trying to think, what would you, if you were a convinced Brexiteer who had voted out of real knowledge and real conviction that Brexit was the right way ahead, what would you think of what's going on? Well, I would say that they have every reason to be more angry than the Remainers. Right. Because, on the one hand, Britain is being pushed around by the EU, there's no doubt about that at all, and from the Brexiteer perspective, that would make you more feel more justified in the way you voted in the referendum. But the British government is showing that it's got no clout. Yeah. It can't stand up to, it's almost like verifying the nightmare of the Brexiteers, but the escape route of the Brexiteers is for Britain to get rid of its chains and to start asserting itself as a great nation again. Well, that isn't really conducive to the picture of what's going on within the EU, where Britain's, I'm afraid, its weakness and isolation are plain for everyone to see.
This isn't just Britain's role in the EU, of course. This is Britain trying to find its place within a broader form of international politics.
Yeah, and so again,
it's a much bigger existential crisis for Britain's role in the world.
It is, yeah, and we'll just have to wait for the dust to settle. I'm still hoping one day we'll have a proper national debate about Britain's role in the world. It shows how necessary it is, but if we'd have had that debate before the referendum, then I don't think we would be in this situation.
Okay.
Anyway, Simon, over to the calmer waters of the Middle East.
Before going there, Mark, you flagged up something that I wanted to talk about, and that was Russian influence. Now, yesterday I received an email from someone who will remain nameless, asking me to sign a petition that that called for the respect of the views put forward by Russia today in the spirit of a free and open media.
Ah, interesting.
Yeah, I thought so. I thought this is very interesting. It leads to some interesting philosophical debates about freedom of the press, freedom of speech, particularly in light of what's been said with regard to alleged Russian involvement in Brexit and alleged Russian involvement in the US election. So I think this is quite interesting in the sense that there is huge condemnation of Russian involvement amidst a lack of real hard evidence. There's a lot of allegations and a lot of vocal condemnation. But what do you think about this, in the sense that should we be restricting that what a foreign press can say, even if that foreign press is the arm of the Russian government?
Well, certainly if you believe in freedom of speech, no, and you shouldn't stop people tweeting. I mean, the thing is it seems to me that a lot of this, just like the attempts to blacken the name of Hillary Clinton, which may or may not have had a Russian connection, I'm afraid if you have an educated electorate, as democratic theorists always burble on about, well then none of this would work. Sure. Trump thundering on about putting Hillary Clinton in prison because of the use of an email account or whatever, when that man himself had announced on camera that he sexually assaulted women, allegedly. No, not allegedly.
Well, not
allegedly.
I mean,
it's just it's a crazy, crazy, crazy world. And if the electorate falls for that kind of thing, I'm afraid if we accept the Russians are involved in all this, it doesn't seem to me that they've done anything which does anything more than expose the gullibility of electorates in Western democracies.
Well, it's interesting you say that. I gave a lecture on the role of the media yesterday for my Peace Studies course, and I was urging people to think carefully about the role of agency within understandings of the media, with understandings of social media in particular, that we shouldn't just accept how certain narratives shape things. We should consider our role within the acceptance or the rejection of those narratives. Yeah. I think that's entirely accurate with what you're saying.
Right, yeah, well it is, and certainly the Brexit thing, if we talk about narratives, we have an overarching narrative about Britain's role in the world which is a complete variance with the facts, and nobody in positions of responsible, none of our elected politicians have ever tried to confront that narrative, and so we've got what we've reaped what we sowed, and insofar clearly the fact that Donald Trump could become even remotely considered as a presidential candidate shows that there is something wrong with American democracy, and if the Russians have exploited that, well, Russians have taken advantage of something which is not created by them, it's been created by, and exactly the same in Britain.
Exactly. Okay, so moving away from this climate of grey skies and rain and sort of approaching winter, I'm staying clear of the phrase winter is coming, but
It's here.
Okay. Well, moving towards the Middle East then, Mark. It's been a rather turbulent time across the Middle East, as you're no doubt aware. I mean, just out of interest, what are the events that you've picked up on as someone who doesn't follow the Middle East as closely as I do?
No, well, a proxy war between Saudi Arabia and Iran. I mean, obviously the Iranian earthquake happening.
That's absolutely tragic on the border of Iraq and Iran, led to hundreds of deaths. And obviously massive infrastructural damage.
But that would be, I guess, that would be obviously Lebanon and yes, yeah.
So Lebanese politics is fascinating. It's a real sort of melting pot of different identities, different political parties, and the involvement of a range of different external actors. But what we saw this past week is that the Lebanese Prime Minister Saad Hariri, he went to Riyadh. He was summoned to Riyadh by the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia, where he resigned. He said, I can't do this, I don't feel like I have the autonomy, the authority to work in this Lebanese context. Now, there are a lot of people who are a bit confused about that and suggest that because he was summoned back to Saudi, that it was Saudi pressure. That he was put under house arrest in Saudi Arabia.
Yeah, that seems quite pressure-ish.
And since then, there have been a number of allegations about Saudi involvement, Saudi coercion, and he's given a couple of really uncomfortable, awkward interviews where he's kind of skirted around certain topics, trying to say, look, I'm not a prisoner here, I'm free to come and go as I please. But I think it's sort of reflective of a couple of different things, particularly domestic politics within Saudi. I mean, that's hugely contestable thing.
Yeah.
And that this young Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, or MBS as people are quite keen to call him, he's solidifying his position. He's a 32-year-old heir to the throne, heir to the Saudi kingdom. And he's been undertaking a series of political manoeuvres that have tried to strengthen his position under the guise of anti-corruption. So you probably heard about all of these seizures of assets and bank accounts and the arrests of various Saudi princes and prominent officials. Now, these are all ostensibly people who are corrupt. But if you scrape beneath the surface a little bit, I don't know what scrape is, but scraping beneath the surface,
We've got to coin a new word in every show.
Well, scrape works.
If you scrape.
If you do that, then you see that actually maybe there are power dynamics at play. And about the same time as this happened, there was a rocket launch or a missile launch from Yemen that was intercepted by the Saudis just before it was able to hit Riyadh airport. That later transpired that there were allegations that that was an Iranian missile fired from Yemen. So it seems that things are escalating in the region quite worryingly. And there are obviously different geopolitical currents at play. Suggestions about the Saudis, the Emiratis, the Kuwaitis and the Bahrainis moving towards maybe an alliance with Israel, moving away from sort of traditional sources of power and legitimacy.
Yes,
reflecting
you can see that happening.
Sort of, this Iranian threat, this perceived Iranian threat. So it's quite worrying times there.
Yeah, and also, again, we come back to Russia and all this, that, the Middle East has maybe not been subject to Russian influence since the collapse of the Soviet. Maybe the Russians are, obviously the Russians in Syria.
Well, I think it's safe to say that the Russians are back. I mean, the Russians have been pretty active in Syria for a while now.
Well, yeah, but beyond the obvious
they are
suspects.
Increasing their links with Iran
and Israel.
And Israel. But there's been a long Russian presence in Israel with the Russian diaspora. The fall of the Soviet Union, a large number, about 1 million people made aliyah to Israel under their right of return. And that's interesting in the sense that there are debates about whether these Russians are actually truly Jews in the sense that they could then make aliyah.
Right.
But for reasons that we don't really have time to go into in Israeli politics, that was supported, and it changed the demographic of Israeli politics, pushing it more towards an economic liberalisation
Right.
pushing it more towards that sort of free market, right-wing politics that now categorises and characterises Israeli politics. So, choppy waters, Mark.
Yes.
Choppy waters.
Absolutely. So, what do you think? What you asked me to make a prediction. So, what? Because I would have thought that in amongst all this stuff, the obvious flashpoint would be Lebanon.
Lebanon's certainly a point of concern for a number of people because of the nature of Lebanese politics, divided into these two sort of serious blocks. The bloc supported by the Saudis, who represent largely but not entirely the Sunnis in Lebanon, and the bloc supported by the Iranians, who are essentially Hezbollah, the party of God, the Lebanese party of God. And Lebanese
I
politics.
think the other side would claim to be the party of God as well, wouldn't they?
Perhaps, yeah, but they're not named as such.
Right.
And I think that these two different blocks are sort of escalating in their importance, and they're stressing the sort of the importance of their positions as opposed to the other.
Right.
Things in Lebanon are pretty heated.
Yeah, but why would you depose a prime minister? Because then there's got to be a successor. Is the successor going to be more pro-Saudi?
You'd think. I mean, the concern that the Saudis had was that Saad Hariri was moving towards the Lebanese president, Michel Aoun, who was sort of close with Hezbollah. And Hezbollah has representatives in the Lebanese government. There's this sense that that Hariri was working with Aoun and working with Hezbollah, and the Saudis didn't like that. So the Saudis said, okay, allegedly, and this is what people are believing, that look, you have to come back, you can't keep working with Hezbollah, you can't keep working with Aoun. So there's this sense that something had to give there. Now the question is, what comes next? If the
That
Saudis,
was the question.
Well, okay, yeah, a good question, an important question.
An obvious question.
Well, perhaps it's in Lebanon. We're not entirely sure. There are a number of candidates that have been suggested as possible successors to Hariri, but we're not entirely sure. It's not entirely panned out yet. But amidst serious economic challenges, amidst a waste problem that has still not been addressed, that there's a hashtag that gained a lot of popularity on Twitter, hashtag #YouStink, which was a way of representing this lack of waste management systems across Beirut, and it certainly did smell. The last time I was there, it was very pungent.
Oh dear.
And you've got the presence of over 1 million, possibly 1.5 million Syrian refugees, putting a huge strain on the state infrastructure. So there are serious pressures, and now there is this seemingly intractable division between the different blocks of the Lebanese government. So I think Lebanese politics is in for quite a rough ride in the coming weeks.
But you don't think there's any chance of proxy wars being transformed into a direct...
Well, people have been writing about this for a long time, and I would argue that neither side wants to have that. Neither side really wants to escalate things.
But if the Saudis are getting closer to Israel, that's a country that might want to escalate
Potentially.
things.
But the
With
interesting
support
thing with
from outside parties.
The interesting thing there, of course, is that if you look at some surveys on opinions, public opinion across the Arab world, a lot of people are still very anti-Israel.
No,
The
you
public
surprise me
opinion.
not.
So you've got this interesting tension between regimes who appear to be moving closer towards Israel and populations who are very anti-Israel. So there seems to be this divide within states themselves.
Yeah.
So I think it's quite a fractious period. I don't think we'll see things escalating towards an open, explicit, overt conflict.
Right.
I certainly hope not, because that will bring in a number of different actors across the region, which will have tragic consequences.
Yeah, I mean, all you could say is it seems that virtually all of the outside parties of any significance will be on the Saudi side, I would guess. Is that...
Well, apart from maybe the Russians and maybe even the Chinese.
Well, but the Chinese would want to keep away, I would have thought, wouldn't you? But
potentially, but I mean, this is probably an area of discussion for next week.
Yeah,
So maybe we'll have a bit more fuel to talk about things.
Yeah, well, we need to do some local news,
Well,
I think,
we do.
because
We're running out of time.
we're running out of time here.
And I think we need to just flag up some local news about tide times, Mark.
Oh, right, yeah, well,
That's
that's
certainly important.
I think that is probably the hot button issue of the day locally.
So we've got in Morecambe Bay, low tide, 15:59.
For those who don't know Morecambe Bay, an area of remarkable natural beauty.
Oh, it really is. Absolutely stunning. High tide, 21:27.
Next time I'll have to guess.
We should do that.
So
We'll do
low
that next
tide
week.
4:52
For next week.
a.m. No, low
Oh.
tide. You're
Low
not doing
tide.
low tide.
Oh, I've done low tide.
Oh right, sorry.
15:59.
Oh, I was only 10 hours
So,
out.
well-
Well, 11 hours.
Yeah.
Well,
Close
I'll
enough.
work on it.
Okay, for next week we'll do that. So, thank you for listening. I should say that you'll
And
be
watching.
able to... and watching, of course. You'll be able to find this on SoundCloud, on YouTube. You can find updates on the Richardson Institute Twitter page, on the forthcoming Richardson Institute website, which will be able to tell you a bit more about next week, hopefully. But you can follow us on Twitter at Richardson
Him.
Inst.
Oh, yeah.
You can also follow my colleague Mark at Dr.Garnett and me at Dr.Mabon.
I'll be somewhat inactive. I think.
Possibly, yeah, but there's a wonderful shot of you swinging a golf club.
Oh, well, that makes it all worthwhile.
It does. So,
Have we now run out of time?
I think we're out of time for this week's episode, so until next week, thank you very much for listening.